Okay. All right, we'll get started. We'll let everybody join when they can join. But so my name is Jen Kaifesh. I'm the founder and owner of Great Expectations College Prep. We work closely with Pally on a lot of things, work with a lot of students, and very closely with the College Center. It's fabulous. And wanted to just kind of give you guys a little bit of a breakdown of what lies ahead. It's a crazy year for those of you who are seniors. I saw we had some people registered who are a little bit younger looking ahead. So now you know what will be what lies before you. But thank you for spending your Sunday morning with us. And we'll do Q&A at the end. So by the way, when you're looking at your Zoom options, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. And then we will go over questions and stuff at the end if that works for everybody. So, all right, so let's get started. So what I would like to do is go over the important dates first, and then we'll break down some things because there's a lot happening. Obviously, a couple of these dates, things have already started happening, but want to give everybody a sense of what's coming up and how quickly. So, you know, applications usually open August 1st. So most applications open August 1st. There are some that are a little bit later. A lot of schools randomly have their own application. Like think of Georgetown, a lot of the Texas schools like UT Austin, and some are on an app called Apply Texas. Pretty much every app opened August 1st, except for the Cal State application. So you can see on here, October 1st is when the Cal State application opens. So don't stress if you haven't been able to get into there, there's a reason. But knowing that if you are applying to schools on these other apps, which we'll talk about later, the Common App, Coalition App, obviously UC app, any of those, they're open and ready to go for you. So if you don't have accounts already set up, it's time. So get those going. October 1st is also FAFSA opens. So the form for financial aid, that's something that if you are applying for financial aid, you want to do this as soon as possible. It's not easy. It's like doing your taxes all over again, as a lot of people described it as such. So I would say get on it, open it up, get the information you need, know what you need to send them, and then recognize, just jumping ahead a little bit, even though you technically have until like end of next spring for a lot of schools, a lot of universities do have priority deadlines for FAFSA, and it's a little bit first come, first served. So you'll notice December 1st, it is also listed as a priority deadline for financial aid at many institutions. So this just goes back to the idea that if you have, if you're applying for any financial aid, it opens October 1st, that's coming up. Again, get on that too. Try to get that filled out as quickly as possible and move it along so you're not going to lose out on any money just because you waited a little bit too long. All right, early action, early decision deadlines, that's usually going to be November 1st to 15th. We'll talk a lot more about that in a little bit, but knowing that there are a lot of schools that it's going to be beneficial for you to apply early if you are a strong enough candidate, which again, we'll break down in a bit. But if you are, that's a little over a month away. So that's coming up quickly. UC's and Cal State deadlines, you're looking at November 30th. So you've got a couple months till the UC's and Cal States are due. USC scholarship deadline, I put that on there because their actual deadline isn't until January, because January 15th. But they do have a scholarship deadline, and you want to be, if you want to be considered for them for the merit scholarships, that's just be aware that December 1st is that deadline. And obviously I didn't do this for all schools in the country. I tried to focus this on the California schools. So January 1st through 15th, regular decision deadlines. Most schools are then, some are February 1st, some are even as late as April 1st. But usually you're looking at kind of early January. And then you have kind of a gap, right? Then it's all of a sudden the ball is in colleges' courts. They're going to be looking at your applications, both for college, both for, for financial aid, anything like that. And you're just waiting. So April 1st, most colleges release results by April 1st. So you usually hear back the last couple of weeks of March. So those are very usually stressful weeks. You're going to getting a lot of information then. It used to be that you needed to hear, like they had to tell you by April 1st. But for instance, this past year, Ivy Day, when all the Ivy League schools released, was I believe April 6th. It was a little bit later because they had too many applications to get through. But in theory, you should have at least 1 month to make a decision, with some rare exceptions. May 1st is National College Decision Day. That's when you have to decide where you're going to go. You have to commit, put your deposit in, all of that stuff. So, so these are just dates to have kind of, in mind, to recognize when things are happening, to make sure you're not going to be far behind, right? And you know what's coming up. But that's, just make a note of those. Okay, the other thing, standardized testing. As I said, sign up for standardized testing or don't. We'll talk about test optional and how this affects you this year. So as seniors, if you have already done standardized testing, you've taken the SAT or ACT, great. If you have scores you're happy with, great. If you are very confident that you don't want to apply with standardized testing on your application, we'll talk about that momentarily. But if you are considering it or are planning on it, be aware of these dates. Notice, so October 23rd, ACT, the official registration deadline did pass, but the late registration deadline, which I think they charge you an extra $20, something like that, is coming up this weekend, or this Friday, I think it is. And then, so you have October 23rd for ACT and December 11th. And then in SAT, you have November 6th and December 4th. So we'll talk about this, but if you're even considering standardized testing, look at your schedules. These dates obviously work for most schools, not all. As you know, Cal States and UCs are test blind, which means they do not consider standardized testing. So if you're only applying to Cal States and UCs, this is not relevant to you. You can totally ignore this. But if you are looking at a lot of other schools, test optional, remember, means optional, right? So the idea is not to just do the bare minimum. If you can make your application better by getting a great SAT or ACT score, it will help your application. It gives them more data. Especially think about the last year and a half. Most students have not done anything that amazing over the last year and a half because they've been locked at home. So you don't have as many extracurriculars. Your grades are a little bit, more unclear to colleges because of online learning. Even schools in West LA, let alone all over the country, handled COVID very differently. And how much guidance did you have, and how easy was that A to get? And, or was it really hard to even stay afloat? They don't necessarily know. So standardized testing will help them differentiate you and really understand what you're capable of if you can test well, right? So a lot of this comes down to how it factors in based on your GPA. So think of it as like, if you have a 4.5 GPA and you cured cancer this summer and your application's amazing and everything's great, then testing, unless you get a near perfect score, probably would almost hurt you because you're such a great applicant without it. But let's say you're applying to a lot of colleges that have average GPAs for applicants of like 3.8, 3.9, and you have a 3.5. Then all of a sudden testing might be to your benefit because your GPA is a little low, but this is a chance to control a little bit more of your application. So just, again, this is something, keep in mind, be open to it. I know, of course, no one wants to test. So test optional sounds very appealing to a lot of students who think they can just get out of it. But the data did show last year that if you took two kids with the same GPA and one applied with strong test scores and the other applied with none, the kid with the strong test scores got in, which makes sense. It's not surprising, but it is something just to keep in mind that it's not like everyone else is applying without standardized tests. So even though you're a senior, if you've got time to test or retest, you've got time, barely. Keep in mind about early decision, early action. This is one thing with these dates. So if you have a school that has a November 1st date, you don't really have anything that will go on the application. But if you have no scores, you can just submit without scores, wait for that October 23rd ACT to come back. For what it's worth, most tests come back in 10 to 14 days. They tell you 6 to 8 weeks just to kind of cover their butts. That's the only reason. And there might be, if there's an issue or your package didn't get mailed because your proctor set it aside, things happen, but generally 10 to 14 days. So if you have November 1st deadline, none of these dates work to put it on the application. However, if you submit it as test optional, saying not going to submit test scores, and then you get those scores back at early November, you could reach out to the college, and if they're fabulous, go, guess what? I have test scores I'd like to submit, and rush the scores to them via via College Board or ACT, and get them there in time to be considered. So that is an option. The December dates, obviously, if you're doing early action or early decision, aren't going to help you because they're going to make a decision about you before you even get those scores back. But if you're doing regular decision, then all of these are going to be okay. So just keep that in mind. If you're applying anywhere else, anywhere that has those January deadlines, all of these should be fine. And even some of them, there's some random ones that have like December 15th, then obviously the October, November dates you'll have before you apply. But point being, if you don't have your scores formally in your hand and know what they are before you submit the application, it's not the end of the world because you're in a test optional world. You could wait and see what they are and then rush them after. So that's just an option. So the note at the bottom, I wanted to bring this up because this is something we do with Pally, and I figured I would just let you guys know directly. If anyone on here is thinking about, well, I wish I'd done SAT or ACT, We do have an outreach program for Pali students, for whom one-on-one test prep would otherwise be out of reach. So we have, we only can work with a few students in this capacity, but if anyone here wants some one-on-one ACT test prep, the email there, the contact@gecollegeprep.com. Email us, let us know, and if we can help you before your October 23rd or December 11th ACT, we would love to. Again, it's very limited, but first come, first served, and we'll talk to you about kind of some options and how we can help. So something to keep in mind if you are thinking about this, but have not had the means or time to apply for any kind of other test prep. Okay, breaking down which test. So on this, and we'll go quickly on this because again, I know some seniors have already made the decisions and are already done with this, but in case you're not, if you're on the fence, picking the right test is key. If you don't take the right test and you just pick one because your parents liked it or your friend liked it, you could be really doing yourself a disservice. So the biggest difference between SAT and ACT, well, there's two biggest, I would say. One is the reading sections. So the SAT is testing what is the best answer. ACT is testing what is the right answer. So that means that if you have a question on ACT about, where something lives in the wintertime, somewhere on line 27, it's going to say that animal lives in the treetops in the wintertime, and the answer is treetops. All right, it's going to be very direct. It's in the passage. SAT is going to ask more inference questions like, in a different scenario, which of the following might occur? You have to go a little deeper for SAT. It can be a little bit trickier, but SAT gives you more time per question. ACT moves much faster. So ACT is a timing-based test. The challenge of ACT is always the pacing, which, by the way, if you are eligible for accommodations and extended time of any kind, then 99 out of 100 times, ACT is the best test for you, because the challenge of the ACT is the pacing. So if you negate that, it's a whole different ballgame. SAT is tricky no matter how much time you have. And the math, just as a side note, it's the same general math concepts. They both test through Algebra 2. And then there are a couple questions that might be pulled from stats or pre-calc kind of at the very top, but they're very few. You can have a near perfect score without those. So don't stress if you're even in Algebra 2, but if you finished Algebra 2, you're technically good to go. The science section on the ACT freaks people out. So I bring this up because people who say, well, I don't want to take the ACT because I'm not good at science, they're not testing outside knowledge of science. They're not testing your ability to retain or recall, random facts or terms from biology. None of that is going to be on this test. It's your ability to read graphs and charts and interpret data that they've given you. So if you feel like you need to be in a position, to have AP sciences in your back pocket before you take this, you don't. So don't stress about that. But picking the right one is the most important step, and knowing what's going to play to your strengths. And again, it's senior year. And if you're a senior, we don't have a ton of time to play with this, but you want to make sure that you've at least considered both and aren't just jumping into one, because most people do significantly better on one than the other. Okay, creating a balanced college list. So understanding these terms, and everyone uses different terms. People sometimes use likelies and things like that. This is kind of the old school terminology. Safeties are considered where you're above average in terms of GPA and test scores. So you always want a couple or a few that are going to be like, I know with my GPA and test scores, I can get in and I'm probably going to get a merit scholarship, right? They're going to be so happy to have me. You're not really worried about a rejection. Target school is where you're basically an average applicant, but in a good way, right? The people they accept are people like you. That's what you're looking for. So when you see a school that has roughly your GPA and roughly your average test scores, consider that a target. Now, reaches is where everyone gets a little bit more stressed and confused about what that entails. A school where you are below average in terms of GPA and test scores, which makes sense on a certain level, but also ones that are have exceptionally low acceptance rates. So again, let's talk about that kid with the 4.5 who cured cancer over the summer. Congratulations, you are at best average applying to Stanford, right? That's what everyone is who gets into Stanford. So that's a reach, even if you're the valedictorian and have had a perfect everything and have changed the world. That's the average applicant at Stanford. You could never consider Stanford a target when their acceptance rate is like 3%, right? So reaches are just things where it's like, we'd be really excited and happy if you got in. Statistically, it's a little less likely, or a lot less likely depending on the list. But it doesn't mean don't go for it. And look, there are some schools that you could kind of look at and go, they don't accept people with X, Y, or Z. but there are a lot that sometimes can be swayed. Smaller schools in particular, if they love who you are and they love your essays and they love your letters of rec, and if you've interviewed and they feel like you'd be a really dynamic, engaging member of their community, they're more likely to overlook that maybe your GPA is a little low because of COVID and online learning, and maybe your test scores weren't great because you didn't have time to prep or you didn't even take the test. So reaches can certainly happen and do all the time, but at the same time, you don't want to count on them. So you want a list that has enough safeties, targets, and reaches that you're balanced and will definitely have good options. Okay, these are terms that at this point, you may have seen if you're on schools and colleges websites and looking at what they offer, but to break down some of these definitions just to make sure everyone really understands them. So when people talk about EA, that's early action. So usually those deadlines, like we talked about at the beginning, are beginning of November 1st to 15th, somewhere in there. And you will receive your notification of the decision by usually mid-December, but even last year it bled into early to mid-January at some schools. Because again, that was, I think, more of a COVID thing, but hopefully they don't get too comfortable waiting that long. But usually, around the holidays. So assume mid-December to mid-January at worst. This is a good choice. Early action is great for candidates who are already as strong as they can be. So that lovely 4.5 pin, right? If you have a 4.5 GPA, you've had straight A's your entire high school experience, you already tested, you have a great test score, you've been super involved in high school the whole time, one more semester of high school is not going to make you a better applicant, right? There's nothing that you're really missing. But if you had, let's say there was a little whoopsies during junior year or sophomore year and your grades dipped, or you haven't had a chance to do standardized testing yet, and that could help your application, then you may not want to do early action because maybe you want them to see that first semester of senior year. And also, especially if you're taking more challenging classes, which hopefully you are, and then they can see that, oh, when she takes harder classes, she really steps up and can handle that workload. And it gives them more information to make a better decision if you apply regular. So it's all strategy based. It's not really about, early action is always better. For some people, it may not be. The big thing with early action is to know it's not binding. So if they tell you in, mid or late December that you've been accepted, you say, thanks, I'll get back to you by May 1st. That's it. There's no commitment. There's no rushed decisions. It's just knowing about things sooner. So that way you can hopefully go into the holidays and know that you're in college, right? Everything's good. So it's just a way to kind of, get more information sooner and move the process along. Restrictive early action is exactly what it sounds like. It's early action, but restrictive. There's something they're not letting you do normally, because usually early action, by definition, there's no limitations. You can apply early decision somewhere else. You can apply to a ton of other schools, early action. They're not stopping you from doing anything else. Restrictive early action, all colleges who have restrictive early action have some sort of like fine print, basically. So this is Stanford, Yale, Georgetown, schools like that. Usually the rule is that you cannot apply early decision anywhere else, which is the binding option. So we will kind of, talk about ED in a second, but basically what Georgetown wouldn't want or Yale wouldn't want is that if you applied to them restrictive early action and they accepted you, but then you had applied early decision to Harvard and had to go to Harvard, they're going to be irritated because they wasted a spot on someone who couldn't have even gone if they wanted to, right? Legally, you were already bound somewhere else. So that's the most common restrictive early action. But then there's schools like Stanford. Stanford's restrictive early action means that you cannot apply anywhere else early action. So if you wanted to apply to, University of Oregon or Michigan or somewhere like that, because you have slightly better odds when you apply early, you can't. Stanford won't let you. You can't do any other school early action, early decision. So just point being on restrictive early action, read the fine print, right? Go through everything very carefully, make sure you understand what schools are or are not letting you do. Early decision. Process in which you apply early. It's almost always November 1st, occasionally the 15th, but usually the 1st. And you agree in a legally binding document that you will attend that school if they accept you. So this, you have to be confident not only in your school choice, because you're not going to be able to weigh other options, but you also have to be confident in your financial situation, because look, they're still going to give you financial aid. It's not like they're going to mess with you and be like, you're bound and I'm not going to give you money. But you can't compare financial aid packages, right? So if you want to wait till the end of the process and then say, here are the schools that offered, different amounts of aid or merit money, and we want to see what those turn out to be and try to negotiate them. You can't if you do ED. So early decision, that's the biggest issue. For those people who are open to it and are considering early decision, keep in mind it also can help you a lot statistically. So depending on where you apply. So if you apply, so I went to Northwestern University and I spent some time in admissions there. I know that school well, Vanderbilt, Duke, schools like that. I always kind of joke that we have a slight inferiority complex to like the Ivies, because kids that we take or that we want oftentimes end up doing, they get into Stanford, they get into Harvard, and they don't go. So if you ED to those schools, the acceptance rate is way higher, your odds are better. Again, you have to be qualified. So people sometimes are like, well, I have, a 3.5 at a school that wants a 4.3, I'll do ED. It's probably not going to help you that much, right? It's probably not going to make a huge difference if you're really far off from what they generally accept. But if you're pretty average, so Northwestern, I'd have to go back and look at their stats for this year, but in the past, it's been like roughly 27% acceptance rate from early decision and 6 to 8% regular decision. So it's a huge difference. But notice if you apply to Harvard ED, it's not a big difference because they kind of know if they accept you, you're probably coming regardless. So they're not worried about that commitment. Other schools that it makes a big difference in, Tulane, it's huge. Boston College has been really beneficial to do early decision. And there are plenty of other schools to have that conversation about, but recognize that the top schools don't necessarily give you a huge bump, but if you're kind of in that next tier with great schools, it's going to help you a lot. Early decision too. All these names make sense for what they are. It's the second round of early decision. So early decision, normal, you apply in November, you hear mid-December. Early decision 2, it's usually the same deadline as the regular decision deadline. So let's say you applied, we'll keep using Northwestern. If you applied early decision in November to Northwestern, found out mid-December that they rejected you, and you wanted to do early decision 2 to Vanderbilt, then you would do that going into January, and they would let you know by February. So it's that accelerated timeline, but then you'd be legally bound to go to Vanderbilt if they accepted you. All of these options are not available at every school. Some schools have 3 out of 4. Usually you have either early action or restrictive early action, but some have early action, early decision, and early decision 2, and regular decision. Others only have regular decision. So every school is different in how they handle this, but that's something you want to be looking at and kind of strategizing. We also have an upcoming webinar. Anybody who's registered for this has seen that list. There is one that breaks this process down a little bit more. So if you're curious about that, that would be great to consider. Okay. So financial aid. So we talked about October 1st, form opens up. Again, technically your deadline's not till June 30th. Do not wait that long. All right. So make sure you get this in as soon as possible. The website at the bottom, that URL, that's where you need to go. So make a note on your calendar, October 1st, get on, start doing it. And then check each school that you're applying to if they have their own FAFSA deadline. Some of them, there's different priority deadlines and different priority filing dates, but others just have a cutoff. It just depends. So you want to make sure not only, again, this is why if you do it early, then it's good for everywhere. But I would always tell my clients, try to get this done in October, at the latest in November. You just want it out of the way and not having to think about it. All right, looking for merit scholarships. This is something that you can do in the fall or the winter. So this is something, start today, but it goes through, honestly, even through the spring. So there are huge corporations that offer scholarships. So for instance, Coca-Cola has a full ride, which is great. And everyone applies for it. So know that if there's a full ride scholarship, that's going to the kid who cured cancer over the summer, probably, right? So most people, those huge full rides, absolutely apply, not to discourage that, but know that obviously the odds are much lower. So you want to look for generally smaller ones and more local ones. So some of these, Elks, Boy Scouts, you have all these religious organizations. Oftentimes, if you have a church or a temple, they will have small scholarships for the kids, that are with them. You have special interest groups. There's tons of essay contests, Rotary clubs, gardening clubs, chambers of commerce, anything. This is a Google search, right? So you want to think of things that are unique to you. So if you're a female engineer who is from a certain country or ethnicity or this, and you want to do that and then type all those words in and add merit scholarship at the end, right? Find things that you think define you, your interests, Look into everything locally, all the small little local organizations. There was, it was a few years ago now, but there was a Rotary Club, an LA Rotary Club that had a $10,000 scholarship that no one applied for. So the deadline came and went, and they had to take out an ad in the newspaper going, does anybody want this money? Like, no one even applied. So there's money a lot of places. You just have to be very proactive and start searching like crazy. Again, Google is your best friend on this. There are other resources you can find online. We have some great websites, but again, Google will get you a lot of places to go find this information. Be proactive, be diligent, and remember, the smaller the actual merit scholarship, the more likely you are to get it, right? So if it's a $500 scholarship, most kids are like, oh, it's not worth my time. I only want the full ride. So they don't even apply. So again, just like that, I mean, 10,000 is not small, but like that Rotary Club was like, no one even applied for this. So if you see smaller ones, they add up fast. If you apply to a lot of those, you'd be surprised at how many of those you might be able to put together. So look into these. One thing to keep in mind about merit scholarships are very, you can have the outside ones, right? Where you're like, your Boy Scouts or Rotary clubs or whatever. None of those are going to hold you, like, I'm trying to think how to explain this. School specific versus outside. Right. So if you're doing Boy Scouts, they don't care what schools you're applying to. They don't care about your financial situation usually, because merit scholarship by definition means it's on merit, not on financial aid, which is need-based. That's another big differentiating factor. Financial aid, when people talk about that, it's based on your income, how much money you have, how much money you make, all these things. Merit scholarships, you can be a billionaire, and if you're awesome enough, you can still win these. So keep that in mind, but recognize there's also school-specific merit scholarships. So we talked about USC has their scholarship deadline December 1st. If you Google USC scholarships, you'll see there's pages of scholarships. Some, by the way, at schools you have to apply specifically for specific scholarships. Others you don't. You're just considered for them. And at the end they go, surprise, you won this one. So look into that. But so knowing there's school specific and knowing there's these kind of outside of the, they're not school specific, they have nothing to do with where you went to high school necessarily or where you're applying to college. And again, Coca-Cola doesn't care, anyone can apply for it. So look for school specific and non-school specific merit scholarships and you will be set. Interviews. So a lot of colleges have interviews, a lot don't. So the general rule of thumb, which is not absolute, but it's a good kind of guiding light on this, is if you are applying to a big state school, they probably do not interview. Just they don't have the bandwidth. That's generally how it goes. So if you are applying to smaller schools, they generally do interview and they want to. If they offer an interview and it says optional, do it. We're going to talk about demonstrated interest here in a little bit, but you want to make sure you understand how the sign-up processes work at each school you're applying to. So I Google, if whatever school you're applying to, again, Google's your best friend in this, but type in the college name and then say undergraduate admissions interview. And then make sure you're looking at a page that's on that specific college's website and see what it says. They may say we don't offer them. It may say sign up here. It may say you can meet with an alumni at a coffee shop or on Zoom. Or it may say, great, we want to set a phone interview with somebody in our admissions office and you'll be meeting with the dean of admissions, right? There's different levels of interviews, but the reality is if they offer them, take the time, put in the effort to do it. They're tracking this. They're looking. If you claim to be really excited about a college, but don't bother to interview, they're going to assume you're not that interested. So if it's available, you want to be signing up for interviews. Know how the sign-up process works. Do they contact you? Do you contact them before or after you submit? So for instance, right now, like Tulane and Syracuse randomly are almost at capacity for interviews for the entire process. They do them in August, September, and October. So if you are interested in schools like that, I'd get on that right away. But there's also schools that they won't even talk to you about interviews until they've received your application, kind of pre-screened you, made sure it was worth their time, and then they send you an email saying, all right, let's set something up. So you want to know those. So you also make sure you're looking for an email. And if you can't find it on the website, call them. Take 30 seconds, call the admissions office and say, hey, do you guys offer interviews? And if they say, yeah, we'll reach out to you after you apply, say, great. How long after I apply generally? And make a note so you know to keep your eyes peeled. Because I've had tons of students who just missed the email where they asked for an interview and the deadline passed, and then they looked like the kid who didn't care, even though they really wanted to apply. So this is about being organized and being on top of things. knowing who you're meeting with, whether they're admissions or alumni, like we talked about, they're very different. Honestly, even like Rice University does it with current students. So you, obviously that's more casual, but you still want to act like you care. You want to dress, at least somewhat professionally. You don't need a suit and tie, but you want to look like you're taking this seriously. And your questions and what you're going to be prepared for will be different if you're meeting with the head of admissions or you're meeting with a current senior. Right. So do your research. I would say, again, you'll get the name generally of who you're meeting with. Google it, like get on their LinkedIn, see what they do. Do your research ahead of time. If you go in, I shouldn't say it's one of my favorite stories because it's awful, but it's also, I think, a testament to how these can go. There is a Dartmouth rep in LA who is notorious because when he sits down with kids, or he sat down, I guess, pre-COVID, now it's on Zoom, but he'd meet him at a coffee shop and first question he'd ask is, where's Dartmouth? And most kids who were applying had no idea. So, and he always said, he goes, the number of people who left crying and never applied and never returned, he's like, that wasn't the goal. He's like, but I want to know that if you're applying to this school, you actually have done your research. So know where it is, know how big it is, know if there's, graduate school attached, is it a liberal arts college or a big research university, know the name of the major you're interested in. The more specific, the better. If you want to say English major, fine. But if there's like an American literature major that you want to talk about, you sound like you're more engaged and truly interested in the university. And always have questions ready on that note. So you're going to have a lot of these where a lot of the student run ones, by the way, are just their job is to interview you, right? So the other way around. Sorry, you interview them to ask them, what's it like on campus? What's the major like? How easy is it to do research? What's, student life and school spirit like? So with students, you always want to have a ton of questions ready, but even if you're reading with somebody in admissions, just like any, adult has when they do an interview for a job, usually at the end they go, do you have any questions for us? Right. And if you say, nope, all good, you look like you're, again, not that invested. You're not putting that much effort in. So you want to have questions ready. They also need to be good questions. So don't, anything you could, again, Google to get the answers, not a good question. Just like, can I double major here? Or, do you guys have research for undergrads? You could find that in 15 seconds on Google. So it needs to be things that maybe are harder to Google or more subjective, right? Where maybe it's more, if you're talking to somebody at Tulane, going, you have such a dynamic campus life, but how often do students go into campus? Like how much of the social life is, or go into the city as opposed to stay on campus? And then it's a little bit more subjective in a conversation of like, oh, well, for, festivals, people do this, but a lot of kids just go in on the weekends or after school for dinner, or they don't, right? So that's something that's harder to really have a firm yes, no answer. So those are better questions. Side note, always be prepared to mention your favorite book. That's another question that a lot of interviewers like to ask. So a lot of students are caught off guard by that. So be prepared. All right, this is old school, but send a thank you note. It's tried and true for a reason. And a lot of the people, look, if you have a senior or a student anywhere at any of the schools that's interviewing you, just send an email. That's totally fine, saying thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. But the older the person is that you're met with, and the more senior and formal the interview was. So if it's somebody in admissions or even an alum, admissions, I would say, if you can and are willing to, youngins out there, do a handwritten card, right? And mail it to them and say, thank you so much for your time. It stands out. It's something that they're not used to getting. They don't see it much anymore. So you are that unique person who did it. Now, if that's super awkward to you, you really don't want to do it, or it's just an alumni meeting where, again, somebody casually met you for coffee or had a quick Zoom chat, email's fine. But send a thank you note. It also is their way, we keep talking about demonstrated interest, to understand how invested in this process are you? How excited are you? And showing that, and I always say, mention something from the interview, something they talked about. So if you're meeting with an alumni for an interview, be ready to say, like, what was your favorite experience while you were there? Or what advice would you give a freshman? Or what would you do differently the second time around? Something, whatever it is, or your favorite tradition on campus. And then mention that in your thank you note, right? And say, thanks so much. Listening to you talk about such and such got me more excited. These things get passed on, and it differentiates you from another kid with the same GPA and test scores who wasn't as motivated and wasn't as engaging. So interviews, again, doesn't happen at a lot of places, does happen at others. So just do your research, but when they're available, always do them. Requesting letters of recommendation. Hopefully you have already requested the letters. If not, do it right away. You don't want your teachers to have to do this in a scrambled, frantic, last minute thing, which frankly, a lot of teachers won't do. they already had cutoffs. So again, hopefully it's all done, but I'm sure if not, just tomorrow, go request letters of recommendation. Generally, colleges want the letters to be from junior year. This year, there's more exceptions being made because of COVID and with online learning and kids having, the distance learning made it harder to get to know your teachers. But you do want to check based on the schools you're applying to, are they comfortable with you sending letters from people who are not junior year teachers? The reason I have this little chart up here, this is from the common application. This is something that anyone who writes a letter of rec for you fills out. So they need to fill out, how do you basically rank compared to other students in things like maturity, integrity, confidence, compassion, right? Things like that. Obviously, you don't want to pick anybody who's going to put you in the far left column of below average. But notice it's like average, good, above average, well above average, excellent, outstanding, one of the top few I've ever encountered. In an ideal world, they'll pick the last column the whole way across. And for every single, you'll just have check marks in that whole final column. But that's not normally realistic. But I want you to think about, if you haven't asked for letters, think about this. Because what's important about this is that you're asking people who are not going to just say, he's good at biology, or he's great at government, or whatever it is, right? Or US history. They don't care. They have your transcript for that, right? And maybe they have AP scores or things like that as well. This is about who you are as a human being. So this is also, are you active in class discussions? Are you helpful to your classmates who struggle with the material? Are you kind in the hallways? So if you have somebody who's also doing, coaching you for, trying to think, like a club, right? Or a sport, anything like that, Model UN, soccer, who can speak to you in the math classroom, but also, in the robotics club, even better, because then they've seen you in different kind of situations. So just remember, letters of rec are not necessarily about how good of a student you are, but how good of a person. So when you're asking for these, again, hopefully you've already done it, but if not, this is the thing to keep in mind. And again, if you haven't done it, do it tomorrow. It should be done yesterday. So get that done. All right. So this is just a recap of kind of the fall action items we just talked about. So in the next month or two, you're kind of creating that college list, right? You're determining if you're going to do early action or early decision anywhere. You're going to start applying for financial aid and scholarships, registering for interviews, gathering and sending all necessary materials. So transcripts, test scores, letters of rec, all of that stuff. Make it easy on the College Center, by the way. Hopefully all of you have opened your files with them. If not, for some reason, then you need to go talk to them now, again, tomorrow, first thing. But if you've done that, it's also make sure you're getting them what they're asking for. Make sure you're on top of everything, and make sure you check your transcripts, by the way. Every once in a while, there are mistakes on transcripts, whether either it's a wrong grade, a class missing. I had one kid randomly at a different school that had a class that she never even took that was on her transcript with a C. She's like, literally never took that class. And they had to frantically work backwards to get that pulled off the transcript. So I would say, you should be able to trust it's fine, but better safe than sorry. Take a look at the transcript and just make sure everything that Pally needs from you is there. And make sure they also know if you're doing early action or early decision, because they need to know, and same, by the way, with your teachers writing letters of rec, they need to know when these letters are due. So you need to be telling them, by the way, I'm applying to UNC Chapel Hill, North Carolina. They're due October 15th or 18th or something like that. They're one of the first deadlines in the country. So you would need them to know and make sure they have an updated list. Okay, so moving on, we want to talk about applications and essays, because this is the big thing right now, that as you're working through all of this, this is where you get to really define yourself, right? Your grades to an extent, not are done, senior year still matters, but you can only do so much. Test scores, again, hopefully you've already done them. Maybe you're choosing not to do them, and maybe you're going to take them 1 or 2 times in the next couple of months. Great. But again, there's only so much you can do there. This is where you make the biggest difference for yourself. So let's talk about the application as a whole and the things that you have impact on and can affect, the outcome a little bit more at this point. So when you're looking at this lovely little pie chart, what I want you to recognize is that it's not exact. And obviously standardized test scores are not 25% if you apply test optional, but the idea is that if you apply with great scores, that plus your academics is half of what they're looking at. The rest is kind of who you are as a person. So think of the left side as like your involvement, what your teachers think of you, how you've impacted your community, all that sort of stuff. The right side, that half, it's numbers, it's raw data, right? It's your GPA, it's your grades, it's your test scores. So let's talk about the miscellaneous section here. There we go. Okay, so This is something for some kids, hardly any of this will factor in. For some kids, a lot of it will. So I just want to cover this kind of briefly. So you can see that on the far right, the interview we were talking about. And the reality is the interview, not signing up for an interview can hurt you. Signing up for an interview and doing fabulously will only help you a little bit, candidly. It's the thumb on the scale, right? So if it's 50-50 between you and someone who either didn't interview well or didn't interview at all, if you interviewed well, it's going to help you. It can be a deciding factor. But it's not like, her grades were terrible and she has no extracurricular activities, but she's lovely in the interview. That won't get you in. So just know that the interview is a factor, but not a huge one. So high school relationships, reputation. I point this out because, and Pally has great with both, but I want you to keep in mind that there are some schools, colleges, that just don't like a certain high school, right? And usually it's because some student at some point broke an early decision agreement with them and they're bitter. There's a private school in Los Angeles that Duke has not accepted anyone in now officially 20 years. They had a huge falling out and are still holding that grudge 20 years later. It's an entire generation of students passed. Makes no sense. That school gets kids into Stanford all the time, but every once in a while you'll see this. And so when we work with students from that school and they like Duke, it's like the reality is probably not getting into Duke. It has nothing to do with whether you're qualified or not. There are factors outside of your control, right? Or this school used to have a wonderful relationship, but then the last class that went there was super unprepared and not as good of students as they expected, which maybe makes them question the academics at a school, right? There's a lot of factors that just know are outside of your control. And I point this out because, look, rejections feel personal, whether you like it or not. They shouldn't in this process, because the reality is they get a few pages to know who you are and what you've become in 17 or 18 years. But I always want to reiterate the fact that there's so much that even if you were perfect, you still wouldn't necessarily be able to get in. So keep in mind, that's a factor you have no control over. Portfolios and auditions. So this is obviously for certain students, right? If you are an artist, if you are in theater, if you're in film, if you're a musician, right, dance, anything like that, your portfolio or audition is going to have a huge impact. How much depends on what school you're applying to. So for some schools, if you're applying to a top film program, they care more about your reel or your samples or whatever you've submitted than they probably do your GPA or test scores, because math will be irrelevant in that film program, right? But there's other places that are like, look, we want a liberal arts education. We want everyone to be well-rounded and get a solid education across the board. So that, again, might factor in, but it's not going to be, again, the deciding factor. If you don't have the grades, they still won't accept you. It depends on each program, where you're applying, what the major is, but know that portfolios and auditions for some are the be all end all. It just depends. We also have a webinar if you're interested in like performing arts and things like that, to know kind of how to prepare for those, how much like pre-screens and everything else are a part of this process and how they're considered and weighed. So I would make sure you understand that if that's a path you're pursuing. Athletic recruitment. I mean, look, if you're going to go to the NFL, it's more than 20%, let's be honest. But at the same time, for some kids, again, it's a little more than a thumb on the scale. If you are a good student and a good athlete and a good kid all around, and you're applying to a not that competitive athletic program, it'll probably help you get in, right? If the coach might help advocate for you at a D3 school and say, this is a great kid, right? I think, be good on the team and nice for our community, lovely. But if you are applying to D1, it's about how good of an athlete you are. And again, if you are, one of the best in the country at something, athletic recruitment counts for a lot more than 20%. So that's just kind of an average based on what divisions, what schools, what sports. So yeah. Then the last two here, demonstrated interest in social media. So let's talk demonstrated interest for a second, because people use this term a lot. There are schools, candidly, that say they do not consider demonstrated interest, which means they don't care if you're visiting their campus. They don't care if you're really interacting with them. The only thing, there's one red flag that I would throw out when you hear that from a school, because there was a stat that came out, it's like over 80% of colleges are tracking whether you sign up for their emails, whether you open their emails, whether you click on the links once you've opened the emails. They're tracking this. So to say they're not weighing demonstrated interest is a little shady. It used to be demonstrated interest meant more about like coming to tour and do in-person interviews and things that COVID kind of changed a little bit. So point being, any school that you're applying to, I mean, look, the UCs, again, the big state schools are less likely to care, but any other schools you're applying to, it can never hurt to be on top of things. So if you're interested in a school, make sure you are getting emails from them. Go through your inbox, do a search. if you're not immediately today, get on and go sign up and get those emails and start opening them. Set reminders on your phone twice a week. You sit down, you open emails from any school you're applying to, and you're making notes. And by the way, if there's something that they tell you about their new building that just opened, or this new professor, or this new research thing that they're doing, and it's possibly relevant to you and why you might want to apply, file it away. Because when you have to write like a why are you applying to University of Michigan type of thing, that helps, right? You say, well, you now have this incredible resource and it's so amazing. If they're proud of it enough to send an email about it, it's probably something you might want to mention in your essay, assuming it's relevant to what you want. Obviously, if it's like an engineering building and you want to be a poetry major, then not so much. But read through their emails, get information, learn about it, and show them that you're invested and that you're putting your time into this and really are wanting to learn more about it. Do info sessions and do virtual tours online if you can't visit. If you can visit, always make sure you sign up through the Office of Admissions when you're there, so they have a record of you having been there, because that can help. Okay, social media. So this is one most of my students push back on this. It's fine, but I'm still going to say it. So most of my students, their solution to the fact that colleges look at social media, it's like 2/3 of colleges consider social media when they're looking at an applicant. They get online, they're literally looking to find the kid's profile anywhere they can. Most of my kids' solution to that is just set it to private, right? Okay, fine. That's fine. But then colleges either won't see, depending on which platform, either don't see you exist or see that you have something you're private. Then they know in theory you're hiding something. It's not the end of the world. Most teenagers do this. The thing I always want to really emphasize is that this isn't a missed opportunity, because this is basically LinkedIn for teenagers, right? If you can use, whether it's Instagram, make it old school and do it for, on Facebook. That way you don't have to worry about your friends seeing, because you youngins who are not on Facebook. But use that and set up an account, and all it should have are like pictures of you looking like a good, interesting, fun person, right? Where it's you with Habitat for Humanity with your hard hat on and a shovel with your friends, or you out to dinner with your parents or your sister or whatever it is. No red Solo cups, nothing scandalous, nothing, don't let your friends have posting rights, but put it out there for them to see it. They are looking for it. Give them something to look at, and a sense that they've learned more about you, right? Give them that chance, give them what they're looking for. And if you can make it positive, you have an advantage. So don't discount the power of social media to be a positive thing here, but just, you have to be careful and make sure you know what you can control and what you can't, where your friends can post and where they can't. And just keep that in mind. Okay, high school academics. So look, at the end of the day, this is kind of done. Again, by the way, just to emphasize, senioritis will hit hard. First semester absolutely matters. Second semester matters a little less, but still matters. I have had students, and I've seen students whose offers have been rescinded because their grades dropped too much senior year. So that does happen. They do care. They check before they accept you where your grades are at. And then after they accept you, you have to send your final grades for senior year, and they will pull their admissions offer if you don't maintain kind of what you've been maintaining. So don't get too comfortable. That being said, your GPA that goes on your application is what it is today, right? You're not going to have a chance to have first semester factor in. They will send your first semester grades, but your GPA is what it is now. Course rigor and grades in general, this depends on where you're applying, right? So candidly, there's some schools that are not that challenging to get into. They're lovely schools, but they're just happy to have kids. They don't care about honors or APs. They're very happy with students who are like B students. A couple C's won't matter. A's are great, right? There are plenty of schools like that that are wonderful schools. But there are also schools that are going to say, look, yes, you got straight A's, but you never took APs, or you never really challenged yourself. So to those top schools, you can be a liability if you haven't taken enough honors or APs, because the reason those are so important is that it gives them a chance to understand really how strong you are. So, we talk about comparing apples to oranges. Think about Pali compared to any other high school. They don't know how COVID was handled, and like who graded harshly, who was very generous with grading, how many hours of support did you have, and were office hours for teachers actually enforced. They don't know any of this. So they don't really know how to compare you. AP scores always help with that, right? It's a standardized test that says, great, we can now compare this kid to this kid who both took AP English. So course rigor helps them, but the grades in those courses matter. But we'll talk about this in the second episode of the AP scores. So anyways, so knowing that some schools really care that you're challenging yourself and that they can look at it and go, oh, she's already taken college level classes, she'll do fine when she's here. Because an AP class is by definition like an intro to whatever class in college. If you haven't taken any, you're a little bit more of a risk for them because yeah, you did fine on the high school level, but if you're jumping in fresh and have never seen an honors or AP, they're going to be a little bit more wary. Doesn't mean it will backfire. And again, there's a ton of schools that are going to be fine with that. But there's also some schools that will be a little more hesitant. So when you're building your list, just look at that and see like how many, kids generally are taking APs and what's their normal. You can usually Google this, by the way. You can find their incoming class profiles. And also, if you're not sure how you compare to your classmates at Pally, you can Google, it's always school name, class profile, maybe not last year, but probably the year before, just because it may not be posted yet. But whether it's 2021 or 2020, and it's going to show you what percentage of kids have what GPAs and how many APs are offered. And colleges get this, right? So when we say class rank, a lot of people are like, oh, well, we don't rank anymore. It's like, yeah, but kind of do, right? So you may not know, or the school may not tell them you're number 37 out of 712 students, but they can see, oh, you have this GPA and 57% of your class has a higher GPA. That's basically class rank, right? That's on the class profile that colleges get. So you want to have a sense and recognize that colleges compare you to your classmates. So, I've had students both ways, Harvard Westlake compared to Pally or Pally to Harvard Westlake. This, I've had kids go, well, am I getting a bump because I did X, Y, and Z, or am I getting hurt because of this? No, Harvard Westlake kids are compared to Harvard Westlake kids. Pally kids are compared to Pally kids, because the way colleges look at it is that you as a student should not be penalized for the choices of your parents to an extent, either direction, right? So I've seen kids who would have thrived or flourished in one setting more than the other, whether small, intimate, private school or big public school. That's not something most kids have control over. So colleges don't factor that in. They are comparing you saying, here's the downside to Pally, by the way. You guys offer 1 million APs, right? There's so much available to you. You have so many resources and so many opportunities. So if you say, I want to be a psychology major, but I never took AP Psych when it was offered, and by the way, some years it's not offered and that's fine. But if it is offered and you choose not to take it, it's a ding. If you go to a tiny little private school that doesn't offer AP Psych, then it's not held against the kid who didn't take it. Right. So that's the one thing to keep in mind. You are being compared to your classmates and what other kids do. So I've had students who told me that they could never handle more than 1 or 2 APs in a given year. Perfectly fine. That's great. But if you're applying to Stanford, Stanford's going to see that other kids at your school were able to take 4 or 5. So then that's the comparison that kicks in. And again, this is really more for the top 25 schools, honestly. Other schools below that are just very happy with kids who've done well, have maintained their grades, are, have shown that they still love to learn and are taking, honors classes when possible, but if they don't, that's fine. There's a ton of schools like that are wonderful schools. So trying to cover all bases, because I know we have all different types of students, on this webinar. Just know that you looking at your actual requirements in the school that you're building, just know this fact. Okay, so standardized test scores are kind of the other side of this coin, right? So your academics, your GPA, course rigor is all being compared to Pally kids. If you are standardized test scores are the way to compare you to other schools, other cities, other states, right? How do you compare to the rest of the country? So this pie chart, I just made up the 60-40 thing because again, with the test optional, it's like 50-50 really, but if you didn't take APs, then it's only SAT, ACT. But if you took 1 million APs and did beautifully on all of them, great, then the APs are going to factor in more, even if you didn't submit SAT or ACT. So it's hard to do this without knowing exactly, the weight of it depends on how many or what you've done in each and how well you did. But SAT, ACT is like fundamental core retention of knowledge throughout high school, right? Like, do you remember stuff from geometry, right? Things like that. APs are like, here are the things I say I love that I want to pursue on a higher level. Here's how I did on the national scale. All right. So AP scores, what you send and what you don't send. This is another question we get a lot. So on applications, there's a place to list your AP scores. 5s, that's the highest you can get, right? It's out of 5. So if you can get a 5, great. Submit it everywhere. If you get 4s, submit it everywhere. It's not a perfect score, but it's really good. You can see it's like getting like A+, B+ sort of grade. Every college is impressed with a 4 or 5. 3s, the vast majority of colleges are impressed with a 3, but the Harvards, Stanfords, Yales of the world, 3 is not great, right? It's kind of, you can see it's like a high C. So they're looking at it as like, okay, you passed the class, but you didn't really do super fabulously. Ones and twos basically are like D's and F's. So if you get a 1 or 2 on an AP, just pretend you were sick that day. On the application, just where it says, would you like to submit or list AP scores? Skip that one. Don't mention it. And they might see, yes, you took the AP class. So they might go, that's weird, she didn't take the test. But there's no way for them to know whether you took it and didn't submit the score. You could have been sick that day. You could have chosen not to take it. Could have been because of COVID. We don't want to tell them you got a 1 or 2. Threes, like I said, 90 to 98% of colleges, you're going to submit a 3 for sure and be very proud of it. But just know if you're looking at those top schools, it depends on what class it was in, what your major is, things like that. So that's something that we can kind of, I think, factor in later. All right, so that's kind of, we talked about test scores and grades. This part of the application, the extracurricular section. So it's how you spend your time. One of the reasons I really want to break this down for seniors, you don't have time to just like go out and change, all of these things and suddenly have, you're gonna be president of all these things or lead all these things, maybe entitle even, sure, you start a club, that's great. But the reality is how you explain it on the application, which we'll get to in a moment, is the most important part. So the most important part is the community impact part. So that's the big yellow chunk there. Community impact is how was either Pali or your neighborhood or your city or your state or your country different because of something you did, right? So if you are, it could be community service, it could be sports, it could be a job, an internship, but if you had a profound impact on something, that is going to be the thing you want to focus on. Volunteer work, it's at 20%, but again, all of these shift, right, based on what people have done or not done. Volunteer work is anything from, working in a soup kitchen to beach cleanups, but you could also make it much more personalized. You could establish a relationship with, homeless children that you tutor on the weekends. You could be doing a lot of different things. If it's more sincere and more connected to kind of who you are and what you care about, it's a better essay, it's a better activity section on the application. Colleges will care if there's a trend. So if you do 4 hours of volunteer time at Susan G. Komen Race for the Cure, and then a month later you do a couple hours at an animal shelter, and a couple months later you go to a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter, you just look like somebody's padding their resume. So you want there to be a theme. So even if there's not, let's just say you are the kid who just did what I explained, right? And you've done all these unrelated things. Find a common thread so that in your descriptions, it could be, that you love helping those who can't help themselves, right? Or whatever it is. But you want to find a common thread that makes it feel like you're not just collecting hours for graduation or to look good on college applications and resumes. They want to know that you did it for a sincere reason. So the more unique it can be. So let's say you've been working, with a women's shelter, right, for the last couple of years, showing up now and then. If you wanted to in the next couple months, get involved, get invested, and sit down and figure out how can you have an impact on the shelter beyond just showing up on Saturdays when they ask you to. And maybe it's that you help, you find an expert to come in to help these women put together a more professional looking resume so they can apply for jobs, right? Or you do a clothing drive to help get them some clothes that would be better for interviews, right? Ways to get back on their feet. Think of things that would be unique, and none of that stuff is going to be horribly exhausting, right? It's not going to be sucking all your free time out of the window, but it's something that shows you cared enough to stop and think about how you could solve a problem. And that's where volunteer work shifts into that community impact factor. So you still have time on this, is my point. So if you don't feel like you have that, this is what colleges are looking for. The way colleges look at your extracurriculars, by the way, is that whatever you've done in high school, they expect that trend to continue in college. So if you have no involvement at Pali, no involvement outside of classes, and look, there's different reasons, right? If it's because you have to help out at home or you have to hold down a job to help pay rent, you have to take care of your siblings or your grandmother, very different conversation. But if you're just kind of somebody who'd rather play video games or go to the beach, they don't want the kid at their school that's just going to sit in their dorms and play video games or go to the beach, depending on where you're at. Or even the brilliant kid who's only going to go sit in the library. They want the kid who's involved in their campus. So they're looking at your activities in high school saying, did they have an impact on that community? Because if so, they'll probably have one with us. And that's a good thing for the college. So you're trying to make it easy for them to see what you offer, right? And how you make a difference wherever you're at. Leadership comes in a lot of forms. So you could be a captain of a sports team, you could be president of a club, sure, all of those things are great. But leadership, even the thing I mentioned about like the women's shelter, right? And if you're helping to coordinate that resume workshop day, that's leadership. You took initiative, you found something that needed help and you're like, I'm gonna make this happen, I'm gonna organize it. You could even get some other friends to kind of get together and help with this. That is great, right? So leadership comes in many different forms. All of them are good. It doesn't have to be an official formal title, although formal titles are great. They want to see that, again, people will follow. One interesting fact, a lot of people are worried and want to either have a ton of leadership stuff or they're too shy and don't have any. The perfect balance is somewhere in the middle. And again, most people are not in the middle. Most people either are really super involved or not very involved at all. But if you are in the middle, it's great. There is actually an admissions officer at a very competitive top school who said that to them, it's a red flag if somebody applies with only leadership positions. If you apply and you've always been captain and president of everything, it sends the message to colleges that you're not comfortable following. You only can lead. You have to be in charge. So they want the kid who knows when to step up and when to step back, right? So make sure, again, when you're describing your activities, you're giving yourself that chance to do so. Now, notable accomplishments, again, the 10%, some of this is for the average kid, right? If your notable accomplishment is back to the kid who the 4.5 kid who cured cancer over the summer, it's gonna be more than 10%, right? They're gonna care that you cured cancer a lot. However, if your notable accomplishment is like you won a poetry competition or a couple contests, or your photographs were bought by a local restaurant to hang on the walls, and you're applying as a photography major, these are things that are gonna be like, oh, really nice, interesting, good job, right? Or you made national merit, you're a national merit semifinalist or finalist. These things factor in, and it's usually based on what you do in your spare time. So if it's something, it's sports, right? If you're the MVP or you went to state and won a big something as a swimmer or a golfer or whatever, it's all fabulous. But this is something most kids have they want a couple smaller things. Again, if you're on the state or national scale of notable accomplishments, it shifts what this pie chart would look like. All right, this is what it looks like on the common application. So this is the section where you will be putting your extracurricular and work experience descriptions. I wanted this to be on here so that you lovely seniors can see how little room you have to describe how you've spent your time in high school. So you have 10 blanks, and you can see it's how many years, right? So did you do it 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th, or just did you start it in 12th? How many hours per week? How many weeks per year have you done it? And then you have a small blank to talk about positions held, honors won, or the employer, or the name of the organization, right? Go on that top line. And then you get that bottom line, one line, which is 150 characters is the max to describe the entire activity. So the reason I emphasized on the last slide, the idea of community impact being important, if you're trying to describe French club or robotics club or whatever it is, saying I showed up to meetings every Friday and we talk about French culture means nothing, right? They're not gonna be impressed, they don't care. Great, you show up once a month and eat a baguette. It doesn't matter, right? But if the description is more like, I coordinated these things, I led this, coordinated this, organized this, founded this, right? Think active verbs. It's what did you do, not what did the club do? So make sure that when you're describing your activities, you're focusing on what your role or involvement was in the organization, okay?
Jen?
Yes.
Just a quick time check. We want to make sure we have time for Q&A. So we're at 11:34 right now. So
perfect.
Just a heads up.
I appreciate the heads up. We got 5 more minutes, we'll be good. And then we'll go through our questions. So thank you though. Okay, so Common App essay prompts. These are the essays that you're gonna have if you're applying on the Common application to most schools. So you have, you get to choose one, but notice that the last one is topic of your choice. So the rest are really there just to inspire. That's it. So the reason this is the most challenging essay you will possibly ever write in your life is that it's something you've never written before, right? It's something that you have to give colleges a chance to see kind of inside you. It's very personal. That's why it's called the personal statement. It's not an academic essay. It's not a straightforward, let me tell you about this accomplishment of mine. It's something that should go much deeper. So you can go through these. One thing that I want you to do, there's a million online that you can read that, New York Times always publishes some of the best ones. But I always want to emphasize, some admissions reps said that they read these essays looking to decide if they want this applicant to date or room with their own son or daughter. That's how they read these essays. It's truly personal, right? It's not how impressive are you, it's how, are you a good person? Are you compassionate? Are you motivated? Are you inspiring to be around? Whatever it is. So just a couple of words of caution, and then we can kind of, do as you will, but I always want to point these out. Number 2 is about obstacles you've encountered, and then when you faced a challenge or setback or a failure. the two things that, well, the number one thing that we say don't do is write about sports and injuries. So look, if you were on the path to be an Olympic athlete, that's different. But part of this is you want to have a unique essay prompt that colleges are really excited about. So if you end up feeling like you want to talk about how you blew your knee and you thought life was over because you couldn't play soccer anymore, but it turns out there was other stuff for you to do and love in life. Adults looking at this who've read a million and thousands of these have guaranteed already read multiple essays like this, but also know that of course there's life after high school soccer. So you want to make sure that you're saying something that shows like a maturity, shows a wisdom, shows something that is bigger than what your worldview might be in high school. And by the way, I say this as an athlete who blew my knee and ruined my chances for recruitment senior year. So it's a big thing for a lot of people, but it's also not necessarily the most unique essay that's going to get the most attention. Two other topics to avoid: anything about community service or volunteer work where you realized how lucky you were compared to other people. That is something you should probably already know, right? So they don't want you to have to go to Skid Row to understand that. So make sure that you seem like you've always been aware of the world around you to an extent. And the third thing is that if you have something really awful that's happened to you or something that you've overcome, whether it could be, you know, I've seen kids who want to talk about going to rehab, eating disorders, a parent being very ill or even passing away. It's not that these topics are bad. There's a way to make all of those work, right? And be very powerful and be very appealing to a college in a certain way. But what you have to be careful of is that at the end of the day, when they finish reading the essay, they need to know why you are a better applicant because these things happened to you, because you went through them. So make sure that if you're talking about how, you know, you stepped up when, you know, your mother was going through chemo, that's great, but that's what you should do as a good human being, right? You're not a better candidate because of that, but you may have had other realizations or learned different things, or maybe it influenced your desire to go into medicine and it's changed your path in life. These are different conversations, right? And then you get more niche in those and more kind of into them. But be careful that something bad that happened to you, you're turning into a positive of why this has made you basically a better candidate than someone it didn't happen to. You won't state that outright, but that's the subtext of the essays. UC personal insight questions. You have 8 questions here for the UCs. You pick 4. They're only like half the length of the personal statement one. And these are just answer the question. They don't want you to go too in depth to the personal side. They don't want to know too much that's deep. They want you to just answer the questions. So you would pick 4, but make sure you pick 4 that talk about different aspects of yourself. So let's say, again, you're a huge, fabulous soccer player. You might want to talk about soccer for leadership experience in number 1. You might want to talk about it in number 3, right? For your greatest talents or skill. Maybe your greatest challenge you have faced is about a sports injury. But notice that you just told a college 3 times about you as a soccer player, which is not relevant to them. Even if you're a recruit, that's relevant to the coach. But yes, have one essay about soccer. Absolutely. That's a big part of your life. But make sure you're picking different topics and you know how these are going to kind of fit together to paint a more holistic view of who you are. Okay, so kind of recapping some of these, what we just talked about, we talked about the scholarships, we talked about that, but once you've applied everywhere, once you are done with the applications, you've submitted everything, you need to create portals on each college's websites. So for instance, if you submit Tulane's application, you'll eventually get an email from them saying, thank you, here's your student ID number and a password and a link to log in. Immediately go log in, and you need to be tracking that they've received everything you've sent. So every once in a while, you'll see it where the college didn't get, you know, whether it's a transcript, whether it's test scores, letter of rec, something didn't show up, or your, you know, one of your uploads didn't come through properly. You'll see green check marks next to everything that's been received and red X's next to the stuff that hasn't. So it's your job to track that, because if a certain point hits and they haven't received it all, if you applied early, they're just going to bump you to regular. If you get to regular and technically they didn't receive everything, they can bump you from there. So it's your job. You're not done when you hit submit. Make sure you're tracking to make sure everything's been received. Merit scholarships, like we talked about, keep applying. You can do it through the whole school year, basically. Keep going. Visit schools between now and when you have to make a decision. Anything that you can be ready to give information or have information so that if you get your results, you're like, okay, that's my number 1, that's my number 2, that's my number 3. Here's what I'll do if I get waitlisted or, you know, deferred here and there. These are all things that you need to keep in mind. Then again, interviews we talked about, just making sure you understand if that's something you're doing now, something you're doing in January, keep track of that. We talked about this, keeping your grades up. That is big. Now, spring, last thing here. So once you have received everything, so again, April, You should know where you've been accepted. You should know your financial aid offers. Everything's come through. This is where you can sometimes negotiate, by the way, for either merit or financial aid. It depends on the school. Like private schools generally are a little bit more generous because it's more of just a calculation for state schools generally. But they might be like, look, we can't give you more financial aid, but we can throw in a little more merit money to match this other school, right? So if another school of the same academic caliber gave you more money, you can try to negotiate. COVID's changed a little bit of this. They got a little less generous with this, but in the past, they used to be pretty open to it. This past year wasn't great, but it's always worth trying. It can't hurt to ask. So if you have a top choice school that didn't give you as much money, go to them about this. Keep visiting campuses to make decisions. If you got waitlisted at a school you love, immediately, write a letter to show your continued interest, like reserve your spot on the wait list, tell them how much you love it, anything new that you've accomplished or achieved since you applied, why you're a great candidate still, keep them fresh, show that demonstrated interest. And then once you have made a decision, put your deposit down. And make a decision is like the hardest thing and the best thing ever. So just be ready, and I think have the information you need to feel like you truly understand what your priorities are in a college and what you're willing to make work, again, financially, emotionally, mostly all the things, and then celebrate. And that is your timeline. So we'll go into the Q&A stuff here, but also just to throw this on here, you can see, here's our information. If you have questions, you can see at the bottom, I do free 30-minute one-on-ones, do a lot of Pally students. It's not a sales pitch. If you have questions, you just want to run stuff by me and have a conversation of what do I recommend or how would this work, you're welcome to do it. And then we can have a more personalized, individualized sort of conversation. So the link is at the bottom there. So if you want any help with anything, we are here. But Heather, I will let you go ahead and lead the way with questions.
Absolutely. First, we're going to start with a question from Suzanne. I understand that there's a section on the application where your child can write about any hardships they had with learning during COVID. Let's say you had an uncharacteristic dip in grades second semester junior year with online learning. Would you suggest the child use that section to write about it?
That's a great question. So the reality is it depends to an extent. Because there's an additional information section, then there's a has COVID impacted you to severe extent. Think about everyone in the country who's had this impact. I think what you want to emphasize is it different? Is it more extreme? Because most kids had to deal with this. The one exception is that in California, and especially LA, schools were shut down longer and worse, and there was more online learning and distance learning than anywhere else. So if you're applying to school on the East Coast, it's maybe worth just mentioning, like, we were online from this month all the way through this month, and had X number of hours of school every day, and it was really a challenge. But if you're applying to a California school, they kind of know. And look, it was hard for a lot of people to do the distance learning. But if you have something extreme where it's like a parent lost their job because of COVID, or somebody fell very ill or died, then of course you put it. But I would just make sure that it's not, this kid struggled socially, and candidly, most people had mental health challenges throughout this. A lot of people's grades suffered. So you need to make sure it feels like it's something that's extreme enough, if that makes sense. But I would say, again, knowing that California schools were shut down much longer than the rest of the country is worth just acknowledging. So colleges know that it was much tougher for us than it was for Florida and Texas. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yep. Next, when you apply, how many safety targets and reaches do you recommend? Great question too.
So I would tell you, we usually say 8 to 12 total, and then you kind of break it down, because part of it depends on with the safety, how sure are these safeties, right? If there's a school that you're like, there is no chance I will get rejected from, and I would truly love to go to, awesome. Then really you need 1, maybe 2, just to be super, super safe, but you're probably fine on that. Same with targets. If you've got enough very realistic targets, which by definition a target should be realistic, then I like that to be the bulk of the list. But the reality is reaches, if you're a top student, so if you're top 10% of your class and you're applying to those top 10 or 20 schools in the country, you're going to have more reaches. It's going to be imbalanced, but they're possible for you, right? Again, any valedictorian applying to Stanford, Harvard, Yale, most of the applicants are valedictorians or close. So it's still a reach for those kids. So they may end up with more reaches, because that safety is a definite safety for the valedictorian. But so I think if you're thinking 8 to 12 schools, assume somewhere between 1 and 3 safeties. I always think it depends, probably 2 to 3, just again, to be safe. But you don't need much more than that unless you really have never had a chance to visit and you don't know where you would want to go. But if you can be like, I know I would go here if I were accepted and I'd be happy, then you're probably fine. more targets than reaches if you can, but if you're applying to those top 10, 20 schools, you're probably going to need more. Yes, that's that one. Next.
Yeah. What about, so if you didn't do as well in your 9th grade year, how is that going to affect things at this point for different colleges?
Okay, so great question too. So UCs, let's talk about UCs first. So UCs, the GPA is 10th and 11th grade, right? So the GPA, 9th grade is not factored in, but they still see 9th grade scores and grades. So it's in there. So if they see this, the fact that your GPA for the UCs, anybody who has a bad freshman year, GPA for the UCs is much higher because they took that out, but they still see the upward trend and they can be like, okay, it was probably like a tough acclimation period. If you are applying to any other school, anyone that's not a Cal State or UC, where they really factor in 9th grade to your GPA, they're looking at this, upward trend is always good, right? Absolutely. But again, it depends on where you're applying, which I know is a bit of a cop-out answer, because if you're applying to Stanford, they don't want kids who struggled freshman year because their kids have straight A's the whole time that go to Stanford, right? There are other schools though that are gonna be like, oh, we completely understand, that's totally fine. And the kids started challenging themselves and doing really well sophomore, junior year. And oh my gosh, their course selection senior year is fabulous. So I think, just knowing that 9th grade being a little weaker can be explained away. Also, if there is an explanation beyond just being hard to acclimate to high school, if there is something that we need to tell colleges, absolutely you can do that. But yeah, I would just say no, that most kids or most schools are looking for that upward trend. So it's moving in the right direction if 9th is lower than 11th. But the top schools candidly just want kids who've done fabulously the whole time through.
Great. This is another question. Are schools talking to other schools during the admissions process? Do they know if a candidate has applied and rejected in an early decision school and applying to them as a fallback?
No, they don't. This is something that people are always super worried about, which understandably so. They don't know that, but this is where demonstrated interest matters. So if you are applying to school that you've never signed up for an email, you've never done an info session or a tour, they are going to feel like they're probably a fallback. Right? Because they're going to assume that you're just tacking it onto the list because your friend said it was a cool school. So that's going to be held against you more on that side, not that they know you applied to a better school or a similar school. Because the reality is if you're applying to Wisconsin, you're probably applying to Michigan. If you're in business, probably Indiana as well. They kind of know that if you're applying here, you're probably applying to these other schools, which is why it's important that your essays are very clear on how much you love a certain school, right? And that what makes Wisconsin better or different than Michigan and vice versa. That factors in more, but no, they cannot track where else you're applying.
Great, thanks. Now, are all schools either test optional or test blind now? And what % are gonna still require the SAT, ACT?
Excellent. So if for this year's seniors, and again, I know we have some younger kids and families on this call, on the webinar, if you are a senior, I don't know of any schools that are still requiring SAT, ACT. So as far as we're aware, and that's 99.9% certain, that all the schools are going to be test optional or test blind. Test blind really is just the California schools at this point. Most other places are test optional. If you are a younger kid on this webinar, be aware that that can change, because I know people in admissions offices, especially at more competitive schools, that are dying to get back to requiring test scores to have more information. So if you're a sophomore or a junior even, there are a lot of schools that have said they're going to be test optional through 2023 or through 2025. Others who are like, we hope to go back to requiring it next fall, right? So we don't know. But if you're a senior, you can basically assume that everywhere is going to be test optional or test blind. But like we discussed at the beginning of the webinar, good scores will help you, right? You want to submit those if you can.
Okay. So how are colleges going to look at last year during COVID, and some SIDS didn't do well on remote? Like, I know we addressed that a little bit in the webinar, but what are they thinking about those students?
So I think the challenge is knowing that every school is different. And this is where if there's information you want to share, you can talk to the College Center about what they're including, because they're giving kind of some background to your experience at Pally and what's offered and how things will run. They are taking everything with a grain of salt. Again, and I hate answering this question for everybody because it does depend on kind of how competitive the schools are. The top schools still want kids who didn't struggle, right? So a lot of people did, a lot of people's grades suffered, and rightfully so. Some teachers that, I know plenty of teachers at plenty of schools that barely showed up for class, had video recording lectures, didn't answer questions. Of course, kids did worse, right? So there is a factor of that they are kind of aware of and you want to draw attention to, but you also don't want to make excuses. So they will take it into consideration and they know that. So that's one reason, by the way, if you struggle during COVID with remote learning, if that's your narrative, that's fine. But then first semester senior year has to be freaking awesome. So you need to be like, now that I'm out of distance learning and I'm back in the classroom, look how fabulously I'm doing. So if that can be part of the narrative, you're going to have a much easier sell to colleges that it was just the distance learning that was the problem. Yeah. Do you feel like that answers that, Heather?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
We have a couple UC specific questions. So do UCs accept you depending on the major or college you're applying to? And on that note, can you apply to different majors at different UCs? Good
questions. Again, it's always good questions. So yes and okay, well, let's break these down. So if they have, if you're looking at, you want to be maybe biochemistry one place, but you're interested in a more flat pre-med somewhere else, or environmental science in another school, absolutely. So on the UC application, you can pick different majors for different schools. What you have to be careful of is that your essays are the same for every campus. You can't change them or tailor them to one campus or another. So that means that if you're writing about why you're passionate about biochemistry, but you then put sociology as your major at one campus, then that something doesn't add up. So you just have to be careful that things kind of sync and look like they fit together. What major you pick does have an impact. So there are literally impacted majors, which are going to be tougher. You can Google this and find this, where you can see that psychology is a perfect example. Psychology is a really hard major. So many people want it. So it's more competitive. So that can have a negative impact. If you pick programs and schools or colleges within the university that are less common and that you are a good candidate for. So in Berkeley, what's the Natural Resources and Management or something like that is the school. I've had kids who were big into riding horses who did one that was basically like they worked at barns and they talked about wanting to own a barn, and there was a major for that. And they're great, but a random kid just picking that major to try to game the system would look ridiculous because you have nothing to back it up that makes it look sincere. So you have to be careful that you're not just like putting a random major that isn't supported by your resume and your transcript, if that makes sense. Did I get all those UC questions? I feel like there were a couple more that I may have missed.
I think you got it. I will continue with some of these. One of them was, again, on a UC thing. If you apply to several UCs, does the number that you apply to or which ones you apply to impact that decision at all?
No, so they're not going to know. And it's not like they're like, well, we know Berkeley's going to accept them, so UCLA is going to say no because they don't want to waste the spot. You're not going to have that. Like we've seen tons of applicants who've gotten into all the campuses, get shut out from the campuses. It's random. So it's less about that as it is how good of a fit are you for the specific majors and program of what they're looking for on their campus.
Great. Do counselors have a big impact in admissions? I've heard that private schools rely on those relationships. How does that play in here?
Okay, so great questions. Again, so I love these. These are all insightful questions. This is helping. So yes, they can, but colleges do know if you go to a large public school that's not an aspect that is going to be in play, right? They can't call and advocate. They don't schmooze with every, Harvard and Stanford counselor or admissions rep. So part of it is that is candidly true. If the school has a great reputation and knows Steve in admissions at Stanford, you can call and advocate for a certain student at a private school. That's a wonderful thing. But colleges do take it with a grain of salt, knowing that if you're at a school that doesn't have that capability and just doesn't have the bandwidth, they really try not to hold it against the kids. It's not a thing. It's more, because remember, you're compared within the context of your high school. So they're looking at it within Pally. How do you fare? And then, yeah, you may not get the advocacy you may get at a tiny school, but that is taken into consideration during the process.
Awesome. And then if admitted through ED and you accept and start attending in the fall, but let's say aren't happy that first semester, do you have any obligation to them that's different than any other student, whether paying for the entire year, not transferring? Is there any obligation there?
Okay, so this is school specific. I would tell you 99%, we'll say 95 to be able to leave some room for error. The reality is that you usually pay by semester. That's how they have you pay. So you should be fine, but knowing when you have to pay, when that commitment comes through, when it's expected, that's key. But also just make sure everybody has a different ED agreement. So some schools may have a different factor, and I would hate to tell you that 100% of schools, or maybe there is one out there. I personally have never heard of any that commits you to a full year. It usually is one semester because that's what you pay for up front. But I would double check. If there's schools you're considering EDing, you can try to Google that information, or you can call the admissions office. And by the way, they're rushed. They're not gonna be like, who is this? What's your name? What's your high school? They're just ask the question and they're gonna give you the answer and hang up on you. So don't worry about asking a silly question or a question you don't want to be held against you. They'll just give you the information and not track who asked it.
Awesome. And then one person said, I'm being told that even though Michigan has an EA deadline of 11/1, that the expectation is that you get your application in by the first week of October. What are your thoughts on this?
So when they say the expectation by the school, I'm not sure if we mean Cali or Michigan. What I would say is don't kill yourself to by the first week of October. Absolutely not. Michigan doesn't really care. Michigan is an interesting one because they're rolling, but they don't tell you in a rolling capacity. And rolling means that as they look at your application, they make a decision and put you into a pile instead of decide. So look, the earlier you apply, in theory, the better. But if you apply at the end of October instead of the beginning of October and you're qualified, you're going to be fine, right? That's not going to be the deciding factor. If your essays are done and fabulous by the first week of October, absolutely apply. So to me, it's much more about how strong is the application. And if you wrote killer essays and things are good to go, but I've watched students get information like that and then try to basically kill themselves to get everything done way earlier than they need to. And then they submit subpar essays and made careless typos on the application and they get rejected for that reason. So again, early's good, but don't feel like you have to do first week of October by any means. Now, test scores for Michigan, this is one of the only schools that if you are sending test scores, they need to have received them in time to have processed them by the deadline. It's like one of the only schools in the country that does it this way. So for them, I would say if you have your test scores in early October, send them right away, and then it's not an issue. You wouldn't want to wait till Halloween to submit your test scores to Michigan.
Okay. Last question that just came in. You stressed applying for financial aid ASAP. Why is that important?
Okay, so if you look on the website that we included for the FAFSA on the government website, but look at school specific ones. Part of it is that schools will give priority deadlines, which means if you don't apply by that priority deadline, you're not going to be given priority to the money, right? They're going to say, look, we're going to prioritize these kids who applied by this date that we asked for, and we'll give them as much money as they need. And then if people come afterwards, if there's money that, we feel like we want to take more kids who need, need-based stuff, sure, we'll consider it. But you just don't ever want to be in a situation where you got left out because they kind of already allotted the amount of money and how much need they wanted to give for that year. But that's the main thing, right? Is that it's not about anything other than trying to kind of get dibs. And yeah, I think that's the shortest answer.
Cool. So I don't see any other questions. So I think we are good to go.
Okay, wonderful. Well, guys, thanks so much for joining over the weekend. And if you have absolutely any questions, feel free to reach out. But if not, enjoy the rest of the weekend and feel free to join for any of the other webinars we've got coming up.